Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our special Ethnicity and Maritime Black History Month webinar. My name is Chrissy Clark, and I'm the Head of Diversity and Operations at Maritime UK, and we're delighted to be joined by a fabulous panel today, Dr. Jo Stanley, who's going to be providing us with a fabulous presentation, and Cecilia Harvey, the wonderful chair of our Ethnicity and Maritime Network. A big thank you to Aberdeen Harbour Board and Stena Line UK for supporting the Diversity and Maritime programme and making events like today possible. Cecilia, I'm going to hand to you, and then you can introduce Dr. Jo Stanley. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chrissy. Good morning, everybody. We're absolutely delighted to be here with you today, or good afternoon, I should say. We thought this was such an important step for Black History Month, to actually walk a little bit back through history, and Dr. Jo is the perfect person to take us on that journey with her. I'm Cecilia Harvey, chair of Ethnicity and Maritime, and in our network we provide a safe space for discussions around race, ethnicity, culture, and share best practice on ways that we ourselves, or things that we've heard of and come across, tackle these issues within our industry, which we know is making strides, but not many, or not big enough anyway, to make sure that diversity is really at the heart of the core values of our industry. And we have had some successes, but we really want to keep leveraging on those and pushing and demanding for more. Inclusion is such an important part, and for all of the networks that Diversity Maritime has, including the one that I chair, I feel that diversity of thought, diversity of experience is so enriching, and so we were so delighted that we could have this session. I'll hand over to Dr. Jo Stanley, who will introduce herself and take us on a bit of a history journey. Thank you, Dr. Jo.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. Can I share screen already? Yeah. Woo. Right. Hello, everybody. And I'm really pleased that you made the space to come to this today. I realise that some people think history isn't very relevant, but for me, my whole reason for being a historian, really, apart from being very nosy, is that I really want to connect the past to the future so that we do things better than we did. And one of the things that's important to me as an expert in diverse maritime history is that I want maritime to be a more just and diverse place. So I feel as much an activist as a recorder. What I'm talking about today is ayahs. The word may be unfamiliar for you, but I'm sure you know about Lascars. Lascars is the very broad umbrella term that isn't necessarily pejorative, that talks about male Asian seafarers working on British ships. Ayahs, there was no equivalent for women. Women didn't work as stewardesses. So the nearest thing there is to Asian women working on ships was ayahs, who were passengers employed by the customers who were traveling. Sorry, I'm clicking to advance and I'm not getting there. Can somebody help me? I can't, I'm clicking the cursor and I can't get to the next slide. Oh, maybe it was just slow. So I referred to ayahs as posh aunties of Lascars because they were older. They were in their 30s, but a huge age range. And posh because they were doing a more domestic and privileged job, particularly than the guys working in the stokehold. But aunties because they could have been connected by family links, and that's something that hasn't been traced yet. So ayahs and armors at sea. Ayahs was the name for largely for Indian women, and armors was the name for largely Chinese women who were nannies employed by European families And as such, they were part of the great imperial and colonial relations of the last centuries. And those colonial relations involved an awful lot of voyages to and from Britain and to and from the countries that we, Britain, were developing or exploiting, whatever term you prefer to use. So these women were workers. They were working their socks off on the ship, as any of you who've done childcare on a plane or ship will know, but they were with the passengers. They were, their fare was paid. They were passengers rather than crew employed by the company. So it was a more elite job. They were solo. There was mainly a couple of ayahs on every ship, and their work, of course, was far more domestic than the Lascars, because they were leading the kind of life you'd live in a grand house, looking after the kids in the nursery, except now the nursery was this ship, which was full of dangers, as you can imagine, including ship's rails that any kid would love to stand on and attempt to leap from. So today I'm looking at who were ayahs and why were they sailing out, what were ayahs' voyages like and how they connected with their shipmates, and what about their arriving in Britain and waiting and sailing back. And then I'll be attempting a few conclusions. And I hope there'll be lots of questions from you at the end. Thanks. So who were ayahs? The trouble is we can't find out a lot about them because they didn't have names like Jasminda Sharawal. They were just referred to as Ayah and then by the name of their employing family, like Ayah Smith or Ayah Jones or Ayah Clark. So tracking them is pretty hard. And obviously each time they changed the family they worked for, the name that they were given on the ship's records was changed. So it's even harder again to track them down. So mainly they did childcare. Sometimes they were also wet nurses, which meant that they breastfed the white European child with the milk that they had because they were taking their milk from their own child who'd just been born. And sometimes ayahs were ladies' maids for the memsahib of the family. In most households in the Raj in the 19th century, they were the only female members of the household staff. All the others were men. So you can see in the background here, the person pushing the pram is the chaprassi and not the ayah. There was no woman to push the pram, unless there might have been sometimes an under ayah or sort of trainee ayah who might have been a daughter or niece of the main ayah. So they were low status and they were junior to the white nannies and governesses who were employed by the white families who could afford it. It was very prestigious to have a strict Scottish nanny. So even though the kids may have found that nanny hell, the family liked the status of that. By contrast, ayahs were beloved. So I met one person who had an ayah who said, we really pitied people who had Scottish nannies because we loved our ayah and we were treated so beautifully. So they were generally really loved by the children. They were kind of almost mothers and often better and warmer than the white European mothers. And they were the object of mixed feelings by white adults because they were natives, in quotes. They were treated with a bit of suspicion as perhaps dirty or lying or not sufficiently loyal. Ayahs themselves were often mothers who had had children and then moved on for economic reasons to looking after the white family's children. And in age, they ranged hugely from below 20 to 60s, and that's what they were admitting to, but generally they tended to be in their 30s and 40s. So we're talking about the Raj, and just to give you an indication of numbers, in 1901, of the British people working in India, there were roughly 200,000. So we can calculate very approximately that there might have been 25,000 ayahs in India if we imagine that there was one ayah to every 8 British people, to every family. But of the ayahs travelling to Britain, there were very few. In 1901, as a sample year, 14 came to Britain that we know of, and 14 went back from Britain. Often it was more uneven than that. Often more ayahs came here than went away. So to give you the story of one of them, this is a woman called Ayah Amma Bird. We don't know her other names at all. In October 1909, so really this month, she was drowned in the Suez Canal. This is what the paper said. Chinese nurses' futile act of bravery, a report from Port said, yesterday, while the P&O steamer Palawan was passing through the canal, a child named Bird fell overboard. A Chinese ayah jumped into the water after it. The child and ayah died two hours later. Extraordinary to relate, the child and Amma fell from one of the lavatories through the porthole. Accidental drowning was decided upon as the verdict. So later it turned out that the child and the Amma were in one of the lavatories, and it seems to me that probably the child was trying to get through the porthole to see the sea. The Amma tried to grab her and grabbed her so much that she followed after, and they both fell into the sea. So it seems to me from reading between the lines that the ayah's motive was saving Eleanor, the little girl. We don't know any more about the ayah than that she was called Chinese, but as she was traveling from England to Hong Kong, it seems to me likely that she was a Hong Kong-based person. And although we don't know her name, we do know a little bit about her employers, Lennox Bird, who's pictured below, and Margaret Bird, his wife, who carried on being pillars of society in Hong Kong. We don't even know if the Amma Bird's relatives were informed. So why were ayahs sailing? They were seen as indispensable on voyages, especially if the Memsahib had many kids, or if the passenger was a widower and wanted the kids to have continuity after his wife had died. And very often they were solo mums of military men whose men were still staying in India on military service while they came home for a period of a few months. So ayahs were sailing because it was normal to have servants. White British families had trouble imagining life without servants, and also to have an ayah traveling with you implied status, because it meant that she was going to be able to possibly stay with you, that your house was going to be big enough for her to be in. Often these employing families were going home on furlough, which happened every 3 years and was subsidized by their employers or by the government. Sometimes solo wives were going home to give birth to their children so that they were born in Britain, or to show the grandparents the new kids. Sometimes ayahs were traveling solo, accompanying the children to boarding schools in Britain. And sometimes they were just temporary couriers hired for the voyage, rather than a continuing part of the family who they'd lived with for months or years maybe. And they did expect to return to India. They weren't emigrating normally. So the only Asian women traveling in the 19th century really were elite women. And one example of those is a lawyer called Cornelia Sarabji. You can see her on the left, second row back under a shawl. That's when she was at Somerville College, Oxford, and she became the first woman lawyer to qualify in Britain, not just Asian woman, but woman. She was very keen on England, and she settled here eventually and died in Manor House in North London. By comparison to ayahs and ammas, ayahs were very much these figures who were involved in the flashy recreational life on deck, as you see in the picture on the left, and they were not uniformed, and they were not part of a group of similar people like the Lascars were. Lascars were very much, as you probably know, in gangs from the maritime areas of the coast where they were all familiar with each other. So your uncle would be the boss, your granddad would be the very senior boss on a ship if you're a Lascar. And in some ways, ayahs can be likened to a little like modern Filipino servants. And I hope you can see the writing on this Filipino poster, which is, she's not just your maid, her name is Lita. She works for her family as well as for yours. And then give her, I can't see that, my panel's in the way, and give her a day off dignity is overdue. And I think this is a useful way of thinking about ayahs too. So what were ayahs' voyages like? How did they connect with crew? These are the principal shipping lines that they were on. P&O, which included British India and Orient lines, Henderson and Anchor Line, and Bibby lines. And so really the ship you got on would partly be, well, if you're an ayah, the ship you got on would be your employer's choice, and your employer would choose based on whereabouts they wanted to go to and from, exactly from India to England, and perhaps their loyalty to the shipping line. Ayahs were really important because, unlike today, ayahs were not catered for. There were no nursery stewardesses at that time. They didn't come into the 1920s. Later in the 1960s, there were children's hostesses nicknamed Chili Hos, but none of that in the ayah's time. And then, of course, in the 1990s, there were the big youth host teams that we have now on cruise ships. So what made ayah's voyages vary included these factors: the ship, obviously the sail or steam affected it, but also the facilities for ayahs, which really were not very good till about 1911. The seaworthiness of the vessel was affected, the season, which affected seasickness. And obviously, if your kids and your memsahb are seasick, and you yourself are seasick, that's an enormous addition to your job in crossing the seas. And also their voyages were affected by whether they were in first class accommodation with their memsahb, or whether they were actually in deck class, which was the much cheaper way of traveling and a much more Asian native way of traveling. The ayah's enjoyment of a voyage would depend partly on her employer's attitudes, whether the employer was tolerant or picky, the number of children you were looking after. So 2 to 4 was normal. And also whether or not the kids were well behaved to you, whether they would come when you call them and obey when you said, no, come away from that rail, it's too dangerous. The ayah's voyages were also helped by how many previous trips they'd done, what experience they had, and their own attitudes to change and to danger and to the empire, the heart of empire that they were going to. There was a lot of enthusiasm for a trip to Buckingham Palace when they arrived. And also the presence of other ayahs was, I think, normally helpful to them. Obviously, it's a complex relationship because there's rivalry between servants depending on the status of their employing family. Normally, the number of ayahs on another ship, on a ship with you, would be between 1 and 10. So what was an ayah's typical day at sea? She'd be waking at 6, supervising the kids' breakfast, then entertaining them in the ship's nurseries, which gradually were emerging after 1900, and they would have nursery lunch. The children always ate separately, as they did in big houses on land. In the early afternoon, you would try and get a bit of a rest and make the kids rest. Then there'd be deck sports like quoits and races and things like that. Nursery tea, which was again separate from the grown-ups. Then the children would be put to bed, and then the ayah would be babysitting and looking after the children while the parents were dining in the dining room with the other adults. If the ayah was lucky, she got to bed at about 10:30. So I really want to talk about the two different worlds these human units, these ayahs and Lascars were employed in at sea. The ayahs were very much in this domestic world of the family where they were known to some extent. The Lascars were very much within the team, within a team, within a team, in that microcosm, the ship that was aimed at getting to its destination. So that was about speed and safety, whereas the ayah's preoccupation was well-being and welfare. I'll give you an example of one case which I think is really tragic. On a ship called the Valet, coming from Ceylon to Britain in 1885, there were a Mr. and Mrs. Abbott. He turned out to be a tea planter, I found. So Mrs. Abbott rebuked the ayah, who seemed much grieved and excited. In consequence of a remark the ayah let fall, the children and nurse were closely watched. So it sounds like the ayah had got a hump and was making her displeasure or upset visible. Later, Mr. Ayah was sitting with them in the saloon, but went to get a cup of tea. He turned his back for a minute. When the woman, the ayah, seized the eldest child, a beautiful, fair-haired girl, and thrust her through one of the ports, and then jumped out herself. Both fell into the sea, and although the steamer was stopped, nothing could be seen of the child. Nothing was said about the ayah, but the final line of the article was, "Great consternation and regret reigned because the children had been great favourites on board." For me, I think this is a possible example of travel rage, that there was just such difficulty and stress between the employers and the ayah, that the ayah, I think, may have punished them by shoving the child overboard. So the ways ayahs connected with shipmates, we don't really know, because there is virtually no testimony by ayahs at all. There's just one court case from the 1880s. We think they probably didn't connect with Lascars very much because of the whole hierarchical nature of a ship, which meant that the elite did not mix with the people who got their hands dirty and were down below at the bottom of the ship. They possibly mixed a bit with other deck passengers if they were sleeping on deck with these economy rate deck passengers. And it's possible that they were a bit rivalrous to the stewardesses, because the stewardesses were used to looking after families their way, and then the ayah was there getting in the way, wanting to look after her family, her employing family, her way. We do know that ayahs shared bathrooms and dormitories after 1911. So after 1911, it seems that it might have been a bit easier for ayahs. They might have been given more space and perhaps a bit more respect. So turning now to the business of arriving, waiting and going home. I'm just going to have a sip of tea. Often when they arrived, they were dumped pretty sensationally. The idea was that when an ayah came to Britain, the employing family would help her find another employing family to go back with, or at least look after her while she made her own way in Britain. So a lot of them were dumped and destitute. This caused a scandal in the papers, as there was also scandal about Lascars who were wandering destitute and barefoot and cold and dying in squalor. So there was a lot of charitable Christian concern about what happened to ayahs, which was about imperial and colonial concern for the natives, and the sense that one had to look after these children of empire, these chattels of empire. Some ayahs did settle with the families, and often they were misfits in the community because they dressed so differently. They were seen as colourful and picturesque, and also pitied because they seemed so cold. Some became Christians. One ended up in a workhouse with her daughter. And the picture below shows an ayah on Plymouth Hoe. You can see her as the only Asian woman sitting in this elite square with all the other white nannies and the white children. It seems to me, from really looking at these statistics, that they might actually have immigrated to Britain more than we historians had initially thought. Sometimes as many as half the number of ayahs who arrived didn't go back, so far as I can tell. So it's possible that they did settle in Britain and they did have British passports, they were British citizens. And it seems that some of them must have married white men in the same way that so many Lascars married white women. I'd just like to draw your attention to this little statement by somebody who had an ayah, Sheila Edis, in the 1930s, who said that her ayah went off her head and let the pram roll downhill. Poor woman, she must have found it so difficult to orient herself to British life. I think she was taken to some sort of mental institution. So here was the idea of the ayah as a person to be shuffled off, really, rather than having a continuing relationship with the family. But later, particularly in the 20th century, Often ayahs were beloved by the families for the rest of their lives. And when the British kids would go back to India, they would make efforts to find their ayahs. Often these efforts were unsuccessful, but sometimes they were successful, and meeting the ayahs' birth children and birth grandchildren was a very moving moment for some British kids who'd been looked after by ayahs. So just to give you an idea of the waiting business, they were seen a bit as chattels waiting. So this is an advert from very early on in the Morning Chronicle, 1795. Ayah wants places, passage back to India. And this is an advert put in by the Mem Sahib, which was the common way. The ayah wouldn't put in her own advert, the Mem Sahib would advertise on her behalf. Lady brought her to England from Bengal after 2 years' service and has kept her here for 8 years. It no longer suits the lady to keep her. Can speak French tolerably well, having accompanied her mistress to France and remained there for 12 years. Will endeavour to make herself useful to any lady who may be going to India. So here was the idea of the ayah as somewhat useful because she was an experienced traveller and she was experienced at handling British expat families. So she may have been able to assist a new Mem Sahib in settling into her new life on ship and then in India. It was very much a case of storing aliens who were waiting their return ships. So that was the case for Lascars. So this is the Strangers' Home in Limehouse, which was built in the 1930s. You can see the size of it. You can see this provision that was being made for all the Lascar seamen who were stranded in Britain, waiting for ships back to India. But also there were ayahs' homes. The first one was in 1830, set up by a man from the East India Company. And it was basically a sort of boarding house, but with philanthropic intention. And then later, the ayahs' homes carried on in Limehouse until 1911. And they were boarding houses, but also acted a bit like the Lascars' homes did, like the Strangers' Home there, as a place where a British person going out to India would go and would say, have you got anybody who would suit me? So they were a kind of depot where you would pick up a potential employee and where the ayah would wait. In the 1890s, one of the women who ran an ayah's home did actually take them on outings, but she found them quite shy and hard to handle, and she was sort of marshalling them as a group around London. It doesn't sound a particularly happy situation for the ayahs, and I'm sure finding somebody from your own part of the world would be enormously heartening for them. So ayahs going home to India, the cost of a ticket would be way beyond their reach. So they needed to get paid for by their previous employing family or to get a new family. And sometimes that meant a very long wait. In some cases, it seems it might have been as long as a year. So the ayah was waiting there to be recontracted. And sometimes Thomas Cook's travel agency or the East India Company would sort out something for them, as well as the business of your Mem Sahib advertising in a newspaper. So if they were just going to be a sort of temp with the new Mem Sahib, they'd be guiding and teaching her, which might have been quite a satisfying role if their Mem Sahib would welcome instruction. Very occasionally, they were returning with their old employing family back to India. And remember, some British Raj families had been out there for 5 or 6 generations, and the ayah and the ayah's daughter would be handed on. So going back to India was not only going back to your home country, but going back to your home employing family dynasty. Occasionally they hired themselves out. There was one called Caroline Pereira who said that she'd sailed to and from 54 times. I checked this and it can't possibly be true. But I do think that there seems to be a tendency for some ayahs to be traveling ayahs who would just go to and from, to and from, to and from. And the money you got paid for that was quite good. It was better than being a static ayah, say, in a house in Bengal. And one of the great things I think that must have been the case for ayahs going back to India is that they would be free to connect with their Asian shipmates. They'd be no longer acting like posh aunties and cocooned in propriety and behaving as their employing family would wish them to. They could just be normally matey or not as they chose. So conclusions, anchoring the ayahs' voyages. They were precariously employed female caregivers, and their economic ties brought an obligation to sail, but also they had emotional connections. They were really connected by the love of the children they were looking after and the habit of unquestioning duty to this family. So one of the common tropes in fiction about empire is the loyal ayah who looked after the memsab and children, sometimes even passing the child off as her own child if the British family had been murdered, say, by insurgents. And so the ayah was seen as, in fiction at least, as so loyal that she would go against her own people in order to behave correctly to the British imperial family. So they were very much embedded in these colonial families and very keen on empire. As I said, you know, the desire to see Buckingham Palace was a very crucial thing. They really saw themselves as Queen Victoria's children. Usually they were the only employee of that British family to be on that voyage. It was very unusual for an employing family to take anybody else at all. For example, the Khitmagar, who you can see here, who's the butler, all those other household employees would stay back. They wouldn't come to England, but it was just thought that the memsab would find it impossible to deal with the kids running riot on ships, especially at a time when children were supposed to be seen and not heard, and an awful lot of crotchety people on ships wanting the kids to be invisible. And you can imagine how tricky that would be. Of course, in the days pre-TV and pre-radio, and perhaps if the ayahs weren't literate, they would have very little awareness of travel and the ship. So the knowledge with which they got on ship for the first time might be based on what an ayah who they happened to meet might tell them, or what their metaphorical nephew, a Lascar, might have told them about the ship. And the Lascar may not have known very much about what happened up on deck because it was such a different world above and below deck, like before, in front of and behind the green bay screen, upstairs, downstairs. So in terms of personality and confidence, I find it very interesting that some ayahs really didn't have much sense of agency at all. They just did absolutely what they were told to do next. But in other cases, they were ready to take quite a lot of charge, including negotiating with porters at the docks in India. And also, in some cases, when the British employers dumped them when they got to Britain, the ayahs would actually sue. In this, they were often helped by Christian charities. So it wasn't actually the ayah making the initiative entirely by herself, but the ayahs did sue for back wages and for breach of contract. And in almost every case, the judges found in the ayah's favour. They criticised the British expat family. So often the ayahs were seen as this picturesque category of native on a ship rather than individuals, you know. So it was seen as typical that the ayah would be sitting or lying at the bottom of a stairway looking after the children, with her sari, with her earrings, and not necessarily speaking English to the rest of the people on the ship. So for the ayahs, it was definitely not a holiday cruise. It was really hard work. And I think we can see that from the stress story of the ayah on the Violette. You know, emotions do get really high on ships. It can be bad enough stuck on a plane for 24 hours, but to be on a ship for 6 weeks with all the problems of a leaking ship and storms and bad relationships could be really demoralizing and traumatizing for ayahs, I think. But what's interesting about them is, of course, that they were brown and black women who were venturing to an unusual extent for the period. They were very mobile, unlike other Asian women and unlike many British working class women. And normally they were doing that singly. They didn't have the assistance of a gang of brothers, as the Lascars did, to show them the ropes in every way about how to get on a ship, and how to survive the journey. So in a way, they weren't entirely unlike these elite Indian lady travelers like Cornelia Sarabji, because they were pathbreakers. And they were not entirely unlike Filipino maids today, because here they were trying to do the best they could for an elite family, mainly because they wanted to look after their own family of origin, their own growing kids, particularly if they were widows. So there was that big economic imperative, as well as the fondness for the European kids that they looked after. Right, I've missed out on whether if you want to be learning more, there's two websites you can look at about ayahs. One is produced by my colleagues in Australia. It's called Ayahs Anonymous. It's got lots of pictures and stories. And on Instagram, there's lots of pictures in something called Ayah's Home, which is about particularly the Ayah's home that emerged in Hackney after 1911, after the earlier boarding houses I told you about, which were the post-1911 home was Christian, was run by the London Missionary Society, and was much more a philanthropic effort rather than a business to house aliens for a period. If you want to look for stories of ayahs on ships, there's a couple of bits on my blog. My blog is called Gender in the Sea, and there are a couple of stories here which you can see the URLs for. Probably you already know tons about Lascars. A very good starting place, if you don't, with lots of pictures, is the one at the top about P&O Lascars. A really thorough book is Aaron Jaffa's book, Lascars and Indian Ocean Seafaring. And a very thoughtful book covering a longer period is Michael Fisher's Counterflows to Colonialism. So there's great stuff to read about Lascars. There's not much about ayahs yet. It's just emerging. I'm part of a new global research group on ayahs, which is producing some fantastic findings, really interesting. And I hope you'll give some thought to the idea of these women as such unusual predecessors on white ships of the British Empire and Iraj. Thank you. Do feel free to ask me questions and make points now, but also contact me afterwards. I really like having conversations and sharing gossip and speculation. So do contact me by email, and do keep up with my website where I talk about other talks I'm doing, which is 2 more about ayahs this year. And my blog about the gendered sea also is going to carry on talking about ayahs. In particular, I'm doing a series about terrible voyages, which ended in shipwreck. So thank you very much for listening, and good luck with your work as members of this network and as people who want to ensure greater justice and diversity in maritime. Thank you. I'll leave the screen up for a minute in case you want to. In fact, I'll go back one so you can see the reading you might like to do. Thanks. Thank you, Cecilia.
Great. Thank you so much, Jo, for that. I really do hope you enjoyed that. I certainly did, and it's incredible to see the sort of what a lived experience can be, and how different it can be, also for, you know, same ethnicity people, maybe, and just different genders. So that real sort of point about intersectionality is one to think about. I don't think I've seen any questions in the Q&A, but if you do have anything, if you want to unmute yourself and put your camera on, please do. Or alternatively, if you'd like to put it in the Q&A, that would be great. If you've got any questions for Jo around the presentation, or just in general about some of her other works, or things that Jo's mentioned that are coming up. But for the moment, I will hand back to Chrissy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you, Jo. Always, I learned so much during your talk, so we are immensely grateful to you. As Cecilia mentioned, I can't see any questions coming in, but for anyone today in our audience, but for anyone that streams this afterwards, you can see Jo's contact details on the screen now. And as Jo kindly mentioned, please do reach out to her via her Gmail, her website, and you can also see her blog. Well, without any questions, we will wrap up today's webinar. A huge, huge thank you again to you both. This has been a fabulous session and we can't wait to continue these discussions. So thank you very much all, and stay safe and stay well, and we'll see lots of you soon. Oh, I can see. Not a question, just a lovely comment. Not a question, but a fascinating look into history. So thank you so much, Jo, that's just come in through the chat. Wonderful. Okay, well, stay safe and thank you so much all. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Jo.